Story 1. I was wearing heels and had my large backpack on top of my hard-sided suitcase with damaged wheels. The wheels got stuck, so I kicked the bottom of the suitcase to get it moving but fell onto and over the suitcase, breaking my fall with my chin on the ground and hurting my ribs. This all happened in the security line. I got up and continued through security. A woman gave me a bandage, which I bled through in 15 seconds. When I saw my face in the bathroom with the fat and bone showing from the gash, I had to call my daughter to come and take me to the hospital. It was mortifying. I bled all over my backpack, my shirt, and even my passport, which became stained while I was in line for it to be checked. I have lost a little faith in humanity. I was bleeding a lot and crying, yet not a single person, except for the woman with the bandage, acknowledged what was happening. I sat on the curb for about 45 minutes, bleeding through a roll of paper towels and looking distraught until my daughter picked me up. Even the security personnel looking at my blood-covered passport didn't say anything. Story 2. The air traffic control radios went down right when I was making my call to enter the airspace, and I accidentally breached the airspace while trying to circle away from it. They reprimanded me when their radios came back online. Then my radio started getting patchy, and I didn't hear them say that I was cleared to land. So I extended my downwind approach to the runway and ended up facing another plane that was a few hundred feet away from me. Fortunately, there was enough room between us for him to land and for me to follow behind him. However, I received another reprimand from the control tower after that. Overall, it was a pretty awful experience. Story 3. I was 16, flying out of Newark completely alone for the first time and 2,000 miles away from home. After an hour in the security line, I was told my form of identification was not valid. The absolute panic. Luckily, the agent took pity on me and said, "You know what? Go ahead." I'm pretty sure it was against the rules, but I was incredibly grateful. Story 4. I had a 12-hour layover in Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. I found out that my mom, whom I was going to see, had just passed away. The airline refused to move me to an earlier flight because I was using miles. It was a very difficult experience. The agents treated me like I was being unreasonable because I was visibly upset, even though I was making an effort to be polite. Story 5. An airline lost my wheelchair for 3 hours. They provided me with a hard rental wheelchair, which caused a pressure sore in an area I couldn't feel. I received several different theories about the location of my wheelchair. They nearly boarded me on the next flight without any confirmation of where my wheelchair was. Turned out to be on the connecting plane, but nobody knew until they checked the cargo hold. When I arrived at my final destination, there was some damage to my wheelchair. The airline had much to answer for after that. This situation is why wheelchair users are often concerned and sometimes terrified about flying. Our wheelchairs are not treated like the vital mobility devices that they are. Story 6. I was in Heraklion, Crete with my family. We were looking at one of those arrival boards that every airport has. About 30 minutes before our flight, we wondered why our plane still hadn't landed. It didn't even appear on the screen. The arrival board was broken, and the screen was frozen. They called us over the microphone, instructing us to go to Gate 7 because our plane was waiting. When we arrived there, everyone clapped. Story 7. Our family booked a cruise departing on August 16, 2015. We were flying out of Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport that morning to catch the ship in Fort Lauderdale by 5 p.m. The day before, an update to the Federal Aviation Administration's en route automation modernization system led to most flights along the East Coast being canceled. We arrived Sunday morning for our 10 a.m. flight around 7 a.m., only to find thousands of people at Reagan on standby. We spent nearly the entire 3 hours before our flight trying to navigate ticketing, security, and getting to the terminal. By the time we arrived, they had already given our tickets away. We ended up in a situation where our luggage made the flight, but we did not. And because so many people were on standby, we could not find another flight to reach the ship on time. After about another 6 hours of running across the airport to try to get on any flight to Florida, we eventually secured a flight to Miami that landed around 6 p.m. We saw our ship sailing away as we came down for landing. We rented a van, picked up our luggage, and drove through the night to Atlanta to get expedited passports so we could fly from Atlanta to Puerto Rico and catch the ship there. That whole situation was a nightmare. We no longer fly on the day of a cruise. We now arrive the day before and stay in a hotel. Story 8. Orlando does not have enough bathrooms or stalls. The trams are slow and crowded. The layout is generally confusing. There are not enough vendors, and the skylights are blinding. Overall, Orlando is a chaotic experience. Story 9. Not the airport, but the flight. We flew to Puerto Rico and had a great vacation. A couple we traveled with broke up while we were there. We had to fly back with them, but they, of course, didn't want to sit together anymore. I sat in the middle seat between them with my husband on the other side. It was the most awkward 8-hour flight back ever. The ex-boyfriend would say something, then the ex-girlfriend would mumble something under her breath. The ex-boyfriend would call her out, and they'd argue. Story 10. Sao Paulo. They were renovating the international terminal. There was a sign down a long hallway that indicated a 15-minute walk from that point to the terminal. A couple of 100 feet later, another sign indicated a 20-minute walk to the terminal. It was a long walk. Story 11. Every time I fly to Sweden, I get questioned at the passport check as if I am some third-world individual who wants to move there. Please keep in mind that I have a degree in software engineering and have no financial reason to move there illegally. Story 12. Dad thought it was a good idea to book a connecting flight that was set to leave about 30 minutes after our regular flight. Naturally, our first plane departed a little late, and when we landed, we ended up at a gate on the opposite end of the terminal. We arrived at the gate just in time to see them pushing the plane back. Instead of getting home at 7 p.m., we got home at 1 a.m. the next day after waiting at the gate. Story 13. Hawaiian Airlines kept an entire plane full of people in the terminal overnight with misleading information about the flight delay. First, they claimed the incoming flight would be an hour late. Then they said the incoming flight hadn't departed Honolulu yet. Next, they mentioned the flight would arrive soon, but a part wasn't working, and they were sending someone to another airport to get it. After that, they announced they could not use that plane, so they had to find another one. Then they stated the flight would depart in the morning, and anyone wanting to change to another flight should approach the podium. Finally, they admitted they still did not have a plane. This resulted in a 24-hour delay before the flight finally took off. The airline provided no truthful information about the delay. Story 14. Slept next to a slot machine in the freezing Reno airport, and then ran through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport like a crazy person to try and catch a flight. Story 15. Connecting flights kept getting delayed, and I ended up spending nearly 24 hours in an airport. I was flying for business, so I had access to free food, drinks, and a shower. However, being drunk at 3 a.m. with no one to talk to in the endless maze of an airport is a terrible experience. Story 16. I was waiting to board my plane, but it was delayed for 1 to 2 hours. I finally boarded, only to face another hour of delay while on the plane. Everyone, including me, was getting frustrated and wondering what was happening. We noticed a few maintenance workers at the front of the plane, which only added to our confusion. After about 30 to 40 minutes, we realized they were fixing an overhead compartment that wouldn't close properly. Took them a long time to resolve the issue. Many of us joked, saying, "Just duct tape it." However, they took another hour to fix something that seemed so simple, and I should mention that the compartment was empty. Story 17. My friends and I had to sleep overnight at Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport because we missed our flight and had to rebook with another airline. The experience was miserable due to the uncomfortable seating and cold temperatures. Story 18. The Charlotte airport frustrates me. At some of the gates, there are no seats, forcing passengers to sit on the floor. Additionally, the airport is crowded, and the gates are far apart. Story 19. About 15 years ago, I had a layover in Atlanta on my way to Baltimore. I boarded the plane, ready to go, when they announced that our flight was delayed due to a 20-minute thunderstorm in Baltimore. I left the plane to grab a quick snack but returned to find that they had canceled the entire flight over the storm. I had been up since 3:30 that morning to catch a 6 a.m. flight, and now I had to wait for the next flight, which was not leaving until around midnight. This was frustrating because my dad was waiting for me, and we would then have to make a 3-hour drive back to his place. I can't recall which airline I used, but they didn't offer any compensation. So, I was stuck at the airport with a carry-on that felt heavier than usual. I eventually arrived in Baltimore around 1:30 in the morning and reached my dad's house by 4 a.m., making for a long and exhausting ordeal. After that, I stayed away from Atlanta for years. Story 20. I grew up in Ireland, and my father has always lived in the United States, so I probably spent more than the usual amount of my childhood flying transatlantic. Direct flights haven't always been an option, so I would normally have to transfer somewhere, usually at Heathrow. Heathrow was almost always the worst, especially the one time the bus from Terminal 4 to Terminal 1 took 3 hours because that's how far the security line was backed up. Every single person on that bus was, of course, missing their connection, so at least there was solidarity in the misery. The worst experience was at O'Hare. For some reason, American airports make you reclaim all your luggage and check it in again, even if you're transferring. On this occasion, it took them 2 hours to unload the baggage from the transatlantic flight, so everyone with a connection was in danger of missing it. When they finally got their bags, everyone was trying to get to their gate as fast as they could. However, there was a man at the exit who had to stamp your customs form. Until that day, I had never seen any version of that man do more than glance at the form, but this man was reading it on both sides as slowly as he could. Someone in front of me asked if he could hurry because of their predicament, and he replied, "You made me lose my place. I'm starting again." I have never seen such a gleeful act of petty cruelty in my life. He wasn't even trying to conceal his smirk or how much he was enjoying his ability to torment complete strangers for no reason at all. O'Hare generally isn't one of the worst airports, but that man gets the prize for generating the sheer amount of impotent rage. Other people have done worse things, but at least they had the decency to pretend they weren't getting enjoyment from it. Story 21. I flew from Toronto to Montreal to catch a connecting flight to Cannes. Upon arrival, we were delayed and had only 1 hour to make it to our gate. The ground crew was also delayed. My partner and I had to rush on foot with all our winter gear, carry-ons, and backpacks. We made it just in time, but as I handed the flight attendant my boarding pass, I said, "I think I'm going to be sick." And I did. I got sick right at the gate, and I was sweating and profusely apologizing. I managed to compose myself enough to board the plane, but I had to sit with my mask on after being ill and sweating for a 7-hour flight. Story 22. I arrived at 4:30 a.m. for a 7 a.m. flight to Wichita. It wouldn't let me check in that early, so I waited until 5 a.m. Then, I found out my flight was canceled, but they had moved everyone onto another flight at 10 a.m. I waited around for a long time and then boarded. I discovered that there was now a layover in St. Louis, which was not a big deal. The layover was about an hour and a half. When it was time to leave again, I found out that instead of going to Wichita from St. Louis, we were making a short stop in Las Vegas. We flew over Wichita to Vegas, had another layover of about 2 hours, and then boarded my flight to Wichita. I got to the hotel at around 9:45 p.m. I did get to gamble at the Las Vegas airport, which was enjoyable. Story 23. During the COVID-19 restrictions, nobody could fly unless they had a valid reason. I was flying from the United States to the United Kingdom because my dad was dying. To board the flight, I had to present a COVID-19 negative certificate dated within 48 hours of my departure. Testing was not available locally at that time, and the logistics were a nightmare. I arrived at Chicago, 6 hours from home, clutching my certificate, only to find out at the gate that it was incorrectly dated, and they wouldn't let me board. I called the laboratory in California and explained my difficult situation as boarding was nearly finished. The lab technician I spoke with went above and beyond to help and sent me a corrected COVID-19 certificate. I was literally the last person to board, and we took off minutes after I was seated. I made it back to my dad just in time to say my goodbyes. I've never been so stressed. Returning to the United States was also an ordeal as I needed embassy approval. They managed to misspell my complicated surname, which caused significant problems at Heathrow. Story 24. I saw Newt Gingrich, but he was in an elevated lobby above me. He couldn't hear me calling him a rude name. Story 25. I ran and ran but still missed the plane. Then my wife told me we forgot Kevin. It took us days to get back home, but it turned out he foiled the burglars with his clever traps. Story 26. I had to sleep on the floor of O'Hare Airport. Flooding in Mumbai affected all the flights. Alternatively, the general layout of Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris is confusing. It takes an hour to travel from one terminal to another. Story 27. These are all pretty mundane. I had a long layover in Newark. The terminal was under construction and lacked air conditioning during a really hot day. Everyone was miserable and sweaty. There was one sandwich shop that had air conditioning, so after waiting a couple of hours, we were able to get a seat. Unfortunately, it was very crowded due to the air conditioning. The restrooms were out of order, so you had to walk quite far to use the facilities. I told myself I would never fly through Newark again, and after a few years, I finally broke that promise. It's a lot better now, though. I was flying out of Venice, Italy. First, when I checked in, they told me that I had canceled my flight. I assured them I would have never done that, as I needed to get home. After some back and forth, they put me on another flight that actually got me home sooner, so that was nice. While I was waiting in line to board, someone tried to cut in line. I was on my honeymoon, so I didn't confront him, but it was still annoying since there wasn't anyone behind me. There was no point in cutting. I was flying out of New Orleans with a migraine and sweating a lot. The loud music everywhere in New Orleans didn't help. I was going through Miami with my family. I allocated 3 hours to get through customs and reach our next flight. Took all 3 hours to get through that line, and we missed our flight. They couldn't book us another flight until 2 days later. We paid for a hotel using points. We made a mini vacation out of it, caught a Marlins game, checked out Little Havana, and more. Could have been worse. The worst part was the customs line at the airport. Someone tried to cut in front of the people ahead of us. They told him no. Then he tried to cut in front of us. I also told him no, saying something like, "You are cutting in front of all these people," while gesturing to the long line behind us. Then, a young woman behind us took out her earbuds and said, "What do you mean, these people?" I clarified, "These people," as in the hundreds of people in this line, but it was no use. She started yelling at me about being a racist. There was nothing I could really do in that situation. I ended up looking like the bad guy. I turned around and ignored her while she continued trying to provoke me into an argument. Story 28. Sat on the plane in July with no air conditioning for 6 hours, while the vent leaked on my husband's head. Story 29. At Ballad Air Base, I needed to catch a flight to Ramstein Air Base in Germany. I spent 6 days sleeping on a hard tile floor because there were no flights with space available for passengers. I ended up surviving on snack foods that were given away for free, and Otis Spunkmeyer muffins were delicious. Finally, on the 6th day, I heard my name called, and they said to go now as the flight was getting ready to leave. A couple of others had run off to the chow hall for real food and did not make the flight. They could still be stuck there. Story 30. I had a flight early in the morning and didn't want to miss it, so I decided to arrive the night before because the airport had free rest areas with bunk beds. However, when I got there, immigration services were closed even though there were many international flights leaving all night. The rest areas were past immigration and security checks, so I had to spend the night on a hard, narrow bench, crying because I was stressed and experiencing diarrhea all night. Story 31. It was my first international flight after the COVID-19 restrictions were lifted. I booked the trip just before the pandemic began, but I could not travel for 2 years, so this was a long time coming. It was chaos. My outbound flight was canceled while I was at the gate, and an alternate itinerary sent in an email was also canceled before I could accept it. I had to join the line with everyone else to rebook, but their call center was swamped, and all international passengers were being set aside while they dealt with the domestic ones. I finally received a new itinerary for the next day after waiting for 8 hours. As soon as I saw the new itinerary, I knew it would be trouble. It routed me through an airport I normally avoid, with a very short connection to clear customs and change terminals to a domestic flight. Naturally, my inbound flight was late, so there was no way I could make the connection, and I spent another 8 hours at that airport waiting for the next flight. Because of the earlier mix-up, that day was my birthday, which I had planned to spend with my relatives. Once I finally arrived at my destination, I learned that I contracted COVID-19 for the first time somewhere along the way and had to spend a week in isolation. I then had to wait another symptom-free week before I could visit my mother in her care home. I do not recommend this experience. Story 32. I had a camera full of pictures and videos from a once-in-a-lifetime trip to the United Arab Emirates, Kenya, and Tanzania. I captured everything from exceptional wealth to generational poverty, awe-inspiring architecture, and breathtaking natural vistas of the Kenyan highlands and the savannas of Tanzania. I recorded a charging bull elephant, lions eating a wildebeest, and took pictures of people I met who I will remember for the rest of my life. Some were elderly, many were young children, and many were hopelessly poor in money but rich in spirit and joy for life. I had around 600 photographs and approximately 30 videos. That camera was stolen from me. It wasn't a high-end digital single-lens reflex camera or a 35mm film camera. It was a 3.5 megapixel point-and-shoot. All those mementos were taken from my bag. That was 20 years ago, and I'm still bummed about it. Story 33. We live in a larger city but have some nearby cities that are sometimes cheaper to fly out of. We book the cheaper flight. We get up at 4 a.m. and drive to the airport 90 minutes away. As we are pulling into the parking garage, I start getting notifications that the first flight is delayed and realize we won't make our connection. I call the airline. Oh, good news. We have a flight out of our city, and we have just enough time to make it. So we turn around, go to the airport, get the tickets, and check the bags. We make it as boarding starts. Mind you, the kids are 3 and 6. It's the first time the 3-year-old is flying, and he's so excited. We get on the plane with no problem, but the door won't close. There's a problem with the latch and they kick everyone off the plane. Watching the minutes go by, I know we are not going to make our connection again. I call the airline and they can get us a flight out of our city first thing tomorrow. At this point, it's 2 p.m. We've been traveling for 10 hours. If we had just driven, we would have already been there. We decide to take the flight the next morning. The kids are sobbing. We go home and do it all over in the morning. We get to the ticketing counter and the computers crash. The security line is crazy. We finally make it to security, but I forgot to dump out my 3-year-old sippy cup. They pull us aside. Please, we need to make our flight. You can just catch the next flight. We have been trying to catch a flight for over 24 hours. Luckily, we made it to our destination that day. Story 34. I was 22 and lost on my flight back to Madrid after visiting my brother in London. I had no money, so at Gatwick Airport, they guided me downstairs to a long check-in line. They got me a ticket for the end of the day, so I spent 10 hours feeling hungry and bored. Story 35. In December 2022 in Vancouver, it was snowing. Our flight to Sydney boarded around 9 p.m., and we lined up for de-icing. The snow became heavier, and after 4 or 5 hours on the tarmac, they ran out of de-icer, and the airport closed. We returned to the terminal, where everyone was funneled through immigration, which took hours, not just us, but every single plane that had not taken off. I was fortunate to be allocated a room in the city, but there was no way to get there. Nothing was open, and thousands of people were stranded at the airport with no food and limited water. Most people were dressed for summer, while it was minus 10 degrees Celsius outside. Some taxis were running, but people lacked winter jackets and were lining up outside in just t-shirts and shorts. My fleece wasn't sufficient for the cold. At about 5 a.m., I managed to secure a very expensive Uber equipped with 4-wheel drive and snow tires. The next day, back at the airport, we had the same plan, and it started snowing again. Hours later, our plane was the last to get de-iced before they ran out again, and we finally took off sometime after midnight. Once airborne, the flight attendant announced that the crew was just 5 minutes away from exceeding their working hours, which would have sent the plane back to the gate. Story 36. On the way to my grandparents in Germany, We had a layover in Frankfurt. However, we missed our connection and had to wait over 5 hours, only to be told that we needed to take the train. We then waited for our luggage for 2 hours before finally boarding the train. Unfortunately, the train broke down on the way to Nuremberg, and we had to switch to another train. Story 37. A security officer at Miami Airport demanded that my disabled child, who uses a wheelchair, stand up and exit her chair to go through the detectors. She cannot walk. It was a humiliating experience. Story 38. Stuck at LaGuardia for an entire day. I only had a sandwich and a small drink for $20. Story 39. I was about 9 or 10 when my family used to travel a lot. One early morning, I got separated from my family and ended up behind a couple I thought were my parents, as they were wearing similar coats and I was half asleep, basically sleepwalking. I held the man's coat and just stood there until they looked around and I realized neither were my parents. I felt flustered, but they remained calm and said something like, No, don't worry, come with us. The woman was looking around the entire time, and then my actual mom and dad came over and said, Did you lose a kid? Story 40. Connecting through Reagan National Airport. Our flight was scheduled to take off around 9 p.m. They delayed it to 10 p.m., then 11 p.m., and finally to 12:45 a.m. Just before we were about to board, around 12:15 a.m., they canceled the flight. No vouchers or reimbursements were offered since it was a weather-related cancellation, and there were no flights out of DCA to our destination for 2 days. Oh, and it was Inauguration Day. Thanks, American Airlines. Story 41. That even if they are national flights within the country where I reside, I must always expect that they will look at me contemptuously or make excuses for being of a bad nationality. Story 42. I fell at the Memphis airport over my suitcase on an escalator. It was totally my fault. The plane at Baltimore/Washington International Airport had taxied out, and my husband had left the area. The plane returned to the gate. I kept calling my husband's office, but he did not answer the call. He thought it was a prank, having seen the plane taxi out. He couldn't believe I was stuck in an airport, but I was. Story 43. Spirit Airlines in Detroit experienced a 3-hour delay. For 2 hours, I was not informed why. Eventually, they stated it was due to the inability to find a pilot for the plane. I departed 3 hours late to Las Vegas. The next day, I received an email from Spirit Airlines indicating that their systems showed my flight had arrived on time and requested a 5-star rating. I have never flown with Spirit Airlines again. Story 44. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had an experience at the airport while waiting for my flight to start boarding. The announcer at the gate requested that passengers requiring wheelchairs board first. Immediately, a family with 3 children got up and joined the line. They had to be told to sit down and attempted to argue, causing delays. Once that was resolved, the announcer called for Tier 1 membership holders to line up, and some women started complaining loudly that Zone 1, where they were seated, should board first because it is Zone 1 and 1 means first. They were eventually ignored until they quieted down. The rest of the boarding process went smoothly. However, there was a situation involving a woman and her baby seated right in front of me. About 10 minutes into the flight, the baby needed attention, but she wasn't allowed to get up to change the diaper due to windy conditions. I understood the rules. It wasn't the fault of the woman, the baby, or the flight crew. Nonetheless, it was quite unpleasant for a while until she was permitted to attend to her baby's needs. Story 45. Flying from Seattle to Las Vegas, we hadn't even taken off yet when the man beside me started vomiting. They ended up moving him. I don't know where, but I never saw or heard from him again. Story 46. A lightning storm in Istanbul late at night near the airport was unexpected. I anticipated the flight to be canceled, but it was right on schedule. The man behind me in line to board was whooping and hollering as if we were about to ride a roller coaster. I sat with white knuckles the entire flight, which was only to Athens, and cried silently. A stranger next to me even tried to console me by patting my hand. At one point, one of the pilots came and spoke to me briefly to explain how planes fly in an attempt to calm me, but nothing could stop my fretting until we touched down. I don't remember it being overly turbulent, just a bright flash at one point. I'm typically an okay flyer, but now if there's a storm on the horizon, I do the same thing. Cry silently and grip on for dear life. I know how illogical it is, it's just instinct at that point. I dislike that I react this way because I feel foolish and worry it might stress others out or make them uncomfortable. So, I try to close my eyes and visualize walking off the plane after a safe landing. It helps. Story 47. We flew into Chicago from Shanghai. Our arrival was late at night, and we boarded our last flight to Cleveland. Unfortunately, that flight was canceled due to an air conditioning leak. These situations happen, right? Our flight was delayed until the following night at the same time. Additionally, United did not remove our luggage from the plane. They did cover a hotel stay, but we did not have our toiletries or any fresh clothes. It was quite chaotic. Story 48. I once referred to my brother-in-law and sister as friends when answering a question from the person at the fixed base operator. They were flying in and I was picking them up. I still haven't lived that one down. My brother-in-law is my friend-in-law. Story 49. The layout of Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport is inefficient. I had a connection that required me to run through the entire airport and pass security again, all in about 30 minutes. However, the worst experience was spending 4 hours in line at immigration in Newark, where I was reprimanded by an official for the minor offense of playing chess on my phone while waiting. I'm pretty sure we weren't even allowed to sit down. Story 50. I was at Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C., with my son a couple of years ago. He hadn't seen Die Hard 2 yet, so all my jokes about the Annex Skywalk were wasted. Story 51. I was 13 years old when I had a troubling experience at Los Angeles International Airport. Some people approached me and attempted to pin something on me. I yelled out, and federal agents observed the situation. They intervened, removed the individuals from the airport, and asked me to sign a complaint against them to ensure they would be kept out. I did it gladly because I was traveling alone and trying to find my uncle. It was a huge airport for me at that moment in my life. This happened in 1976. Story 52. A 2-hour delay at a rural airport, connecting to a major one for a final flight home. Since it was a rural airport, the entire arrivals and departure area was one room, with one security line for both checked and carry-on items. The weather was 40 degrees and sunny, making it stifling inside. There were no food or drink options, not even a vending machine. Upon landing, everyone with a connecting flight had to go to the airline's desk, which was crowded, to sort out our newly rebooked connections. I was fortunate to get a direct flight home, but my colleague was booked on another connecting flight. I was also seated in 35A all the way at the back of the plane. They did not provide a drink service, and the only people who got off after me were the flight attendants. Story 53. There was a 24-hour delay in the Cayman Islands. I was a kid, and this was before any technology that could distract you. The airport was small and, if I recall correctly, had nothing but cigar and coffee shops. Story 54. Heading towards Shannon International Airport in Ireland in the spring of 1973 with my father, we were stopped at a checkpoint by 2 soldiers carrying machine guns. This was my first time seeing a military weapon in person, and it made an impression. I was 9. They asked my dad where we were going. He replied, "The airport to pick up tickets." The lead soldier said, "That's not where you are going." My dad responded, "You're right. We are going back to our hotel. I guess we got the tickets because we did fly home." As an adult, I know about the troubles, so I understand the security measures, but as a young American kid, it was frightening. Those guards didn't bother to hide their mood. Story 55. I had a long-sleeve shirt that I liked to wear while flying because it was very comfortable. However, every time I went through security, it would set off the machine, and I would be pulled aside for a wanding and pat down. It was inconvenient, but the worst part was that even though I asked, they wouldn't tell me what had triggered the alarm so I could avoid it in the future. Story 56. I met a woman while I was in Salt Lake City on business. We continued a flirtation after the trip, and she invited me to return for a weekend. On the first night, she decided she didn't want to be physical with me. So we spent the next 2 days as awkward friends. with me sleeping in her bed and her on the couch. On the final night at 1 a.m., she drunkenly yelled at me for being a jerk all weekend, but could only say, "You asked me if I realized my shower was leaking." She kicked me out of her apartment, and I took a ride to the airport, arriving at 2 a.m., 10 hours before my flight departed. So, I spent a long, cold night in the Salt Lake City airport, sitting in a hard plastic chair, humiliated and alone. At least the Wi-Fi worked, so I was able to watch a full season of Doom Patrol. Story 57. I traveled to Hanoi from Bangkok for a few days without bringing warm clothes. It was extremely cold in Hanoi, and I developed a severe flu-like illness. Somehow, I managed to get to the airport, check in, and board the plane. I slept the entire way to Bangkok and thankfully had a hotel at the airport where I stayed in a delirious state for about 2 days. Story 58. Earlier this year, I was in Harbin, China, and for context, my Chinese isn't good enough to understand full sentences. I arrived at the airport and asked the staff whether my luggage would automatically be transferred to the next flight. The staff began speaking in Chinese, and I couldn't even understand half of what he said. When he handed me the first leg of the flight ticket, I noticed my boarding time was 10 hours later, which meant I would definitely miss my connecting flight. I finally realized what the staff had been trying to explain when I was checking in my luggage. It turns out the airline didn't even bother to inform me that my flight had been delayed. I went straight to customer service, and with my limited Chinese, I tried to explain the situation. I ended up crying and pleading with the agent to put me on the next flight for free. Honestly, I'm not even sure why I had to plead when it should have been an automatic transfer to the next available flight. To top it all off, my eSIM data died while I was in China. Story 59. Does it count if it was on a flight to a connection? I was on a plane from Taipei to Warsaw when the flight attendant accidentally spilled boiling hot coffee on my thigh. They didn't have any ice packs, so she gave me a lot of wet wipes and first-class pajamas to change into. When we landed, I had a pretty bad burn on my thigh, to say the least. We tried to find a drugstore to get some aloe vera, but unfortunately, they only had sunscreen or after-sun products. We bought that, and I had to wait 6 hours for my next flight to Munich and then 3 hours for the final flight home, all the while my thigh hurt more than anything else. Story 60. Last year at the end of the summer holiday season, we went to Turkey and arrived at Antalya Airport. On our way back, our flight was delayed by about 2 hours. Prior to that, the transfer from the hotel took about 3.5 hours. The airport was overcrowded, with insufficient seating for the large number of people. The price of water, even for a half-liter bottle, was about €4, and they informed us that the tap water was not safe for drinking. Story 61. I arrived early for my flight, but got stuck in a Transportation Security Administration line that took 2 hours, causing me to miss my flight. Cost me about 8 to 9 hours and a few $100s to get a seat on the next available flight. I submitted a complaint to the Transportation Security Administration, and they took several months to respond with a dismissive reply. Story 62. I was patted down for the first time while wearing the sunflower lanyard. Now I wait until I am through security before wearing it. Story 63. Let's see. A full pat-down in front of everyone at the Transportation Security Administration checkpoint, being told not to wear an underwire bra in the future while everyone looked on. The 32-hour trip from hell that should have taken 2.5 hours. Sitting on the tarmac in Phoenix for 3 hours while they decided if they should change the tire or just inflate it. Moving the gates 5 times for the same flight, and none were close to each other. There are so many issues. Story 64. I was 12 and went with my mom to Colorado. We had to change planes in Denver with a 30-minute layover, but our luggage wasn't checked through, so we had to run the entire way with our suitcases. Not only was it stressful, I felt embarrassed like only an overweight preteen forced to run in public can feel. Story 65. Coming back from Las Vegas, sleep-deprived and probably still under the influence. I just went through the Transportation Security Administration, and right as my carry-on exited the X-ray machine, the airport decided that was the time to conduct a drill. Not thinking, I went to grab my bag. It was the wrong move. Multiple firearms were pointed at me with orders to stand still. I'm relieved I didn't get detained, or even worse, shot. Story 66. I landed, and the Transportation Security Administration held me for 5 hours because of racial profiling. Additionally, I have a disability. This experience has traumatized me and made me dread flying. Every time I see the Transportation Security Administration, I experience panic attacks. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.